How are you? Welcome to Critical Move in Telesur. Very difficult to forecast what will be the economic impact that the current coronavirus pandemic will have in the world economy, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, our immediate surroundings. However, said the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean just released these findings, which are worth analyzing. We're talking about geoeconomics today. Let's set up the board. We're making the first move. Before going into the substance, let's listen to some considerations by international organizations, including the ECLAC's top representative in this context. We know that this is much more than a health crisis. We are all aware of the profound social and economic consequences of the pandemic. The restrictions that many countries have established to protect health are strongly affecting the income of people, families, economies, and communities. Nationals. We are in a shared fight to protect both life and livelihoods. We call on all countries to eliminate the financial barriers to COVID-19. If people delay care or avoid it because they can't afford it, they don't only harm themselves, they make the pandemic harder to control and put society at risk. Some countries are suspending user fees and providing free testing, regardless of a person's insurance, citizenship, or residence status. We applaud these measures. We have reassessed the project for growth for 2020 and 2021. It is now clear that we have entered a recession as bad or worse than in 2009. We do project recovery in 2021. In fact, there may be a sizable rebound, but only if we succeed with containing the virus everywhere and prevent liquidity problems from becoming a solvency issue. Clearly, the domestic resources are insufficient, and this is why it is so important that the IMF mobilizes rapidly with the appropriate type of instruments to respond to this crisis. We do not have enough productive capabilities, but we have to pay attention to them because the resilience of the countries will depend on their productive structure and regional integration, because this crisis may deepen the inequalities between regions and sub-regions. Without a doubt, sub-regional coordination and integration beyond political differences, we have to secure supply chains of critical goods. Let's review what ECLAC's forecast is according to its most recent report. Last April 3rd, during a virtual conference, the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC, presented a report on the economic and social effects in the region facing the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Commission, the region confronts the pandemic from a weaker position than that of the rest of the world. In its pre-forecast, ECLAC had foreseen that the economy of Latin America and the Caribbean would grow at a maximum of 1.3% in 2020. Now the economy and social crisis unleashed by the coronavirus have prompted it to change its estimates and forecast a decline of at least 1.8% in GDP. Another important fact that the report highlights is that the development of the pandemic could lead to a contraction of between 3% and 4% or even worse. According to the text, the indirect effects of the crisis unleashed by the pandemic are affecting trade in the region through the five external channels: the decline in economic activity among these main trading partners, the falling commodity prices, the interruption of global value chains, and the worsening of global financial conditions. The document explains that even before the spread of COVID-19, the social situation in Latin America and the Caribbean was deteriorating, as shown by the increase in the poverty rate, the persistence of inequalities, and generalized discontent. ECLAC forecasts strong impacts in the health sectors due to the shortage of skilled labor and medical supplies, as well as the increase in costs, because most countries have not invested what is necessary in healthcare. With regards to education, ECLAC warns that the interruption of activity in schools will have significant effects on learning, especially on the most vulnerable social sectors, as there is disparate access to digital devices and the internet between urban and rural populations. Also, many institutions lack the necessary digital technology infrastructure to carry out education from home. Given the regional economic and social inequalities, the effects of unemployment will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. As a recommendation, ECLAC calls for the implementation of a efficacious stimulus package with the aim of strengthening health systems, protecting income and jobs, and strengthening social protection systems to support the most disadvantaged populations. Likewise, it requests central banks to ensure liquidity of companies to guarantee their operation and the stability of the financial system. On the other hand, international cooperation and multilateral organizations should design new technical and financial instruments to support countries, considering the possibility of granting low-interest loans as well as relief or defer debt servicing. This pandemic has the potential to give new shape to the geopolitics of globalization, and it is also an opportunity to recall the benefits of multilateral measures and start critical actions to achieve a sustainable and inclusive economic model, concludes the ECLAC report. And in keeping with this, let's remember the situation worldwide in terms of foreign debt. And by the way, let us remember that we're going to dedicate our show to this issue. And for instance, the Minister of Communication of Venezuela, with date effects, published the following article: CELAC urges to forgive debt of Latin America in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Latin American Strategic Center for Geopolitics led a campaign on Tuesday joined by several political personalities, calling for writing off the Latin American external debt in the face of the health emergency caused by the COVID-19. The initiative has been signed by former presidents Rafael Correa from Ecuador, Ernesto Samper, Colombia, Dilma Rousseff, Brazil, among others, who believe that the debt cancellation is a critical measure to address the health emergency and the economic crisis unleashed by the COVID-19. Therefore, international and private creditors are urged to accept an immediate debt restructuring process, which includes a 2-year payment moratorium without interest. I reiterate, this is the issue to which we are dedicating one of our critical moves. I also take advantage of the opportunity to recommend the in-depth reading of this article entitled Deadly Viruses, Neoliberalism and COVID-19, written by Pablo Jofre Leal and published on our Telesur website last March 25th. Let me choose some of these paragraphs. When we look at the records and history of two global institutions linked to the world of finance, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it is quite clear that the aforementioned international institutions have been pioneers and leading activists in the consolidation of what is called neoliberalism. On March 2nd, an infographic was published on the IMF website, which showed its role in the fight against the coronavirus crisis in terms of providing funds to combat this scourge. But curiously, these items have not been earmarked to Venezuela, for example, showing the true face of the IMF, an organization at Washington service and the blackmail, which exercises its influence on which country is or is not allowed access to fresh currency. On March 4th, another report was published which shows that the IMF is planning to grant financial credits of up to $10 billion to low-income countries and new markets to which they have been affected by the COVID virus. This report was immediately published by news agencies around the world as an example of the good side of the IMF in the face of the pandemic. The reporters, however, failed to mention how deep the future of the hundreds of millions of human beings have been mortgaged. Taking advantage of the crisis, governments will be required to privatize the few services that are still public and then will be granted onerous loans. The historical experience of the countries affected by the IMF policies leads to the conclusion, based on empirical evidence, that the number of victims of neoliberalism will be hundreds of times higher than the victims of the COVID-19. Although the Latin American countries, just like the other countries in the world, have been affected by this virus, let us bear in mind that with self-protection, respect, empathy, care, social solidarity, and safeguarding individual and collective health, we can overcome this fearful enemy which is the COVID-19. It will take some time, but we will prevail, And along the way, we must be on the alert to avoid that under the shadow of the coronavirus, other economic and political failures are not imposed on Latin American countries. To overcome this crisis, it would be enough to look back at history and learn from its lessons. As we said from the beginning of the show, ECLAC made its report public and is forecasting, giving forecasts on the impact of the COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean. On this, we'll have Paola Dratnik expanding on the issue. Go ahead, Paola. Among the figures put out by ECLAC, women are at a low point. Even before the crisis, we dedicated between 22 to 48 hours a week to house chores. The truth is that during the pandemic, the amount of hours of work at home by women will intensify much more. But in addition to that, the pressure on health systems, the precarious health systems in the region is going to be affecting mostly women, because 72% of people working in the health systems in the region are women. Therefore, there was special emphasis on how we're going to face this pandemic, particularly in terms of women in Latin America, a region which ECLA says has a weaker situation than the other countries around the world. Another point we can fail to mention is that the report by ECLAC makes emphasis on the need that economic sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela are lifted. These times of solidarity, it's time for solidarity and not exclusion, said Alicia Barcelona, the director of ECLAC. Thank you, Paola. Very much in tune to what we are discussing and the claims from ECLAC. But we'll continue to go deeper in our countries. We will go to Ecuador with Denise Herrera. Tell us. That's right, Ray. Greetings to you and the viewers of Telesur. Without a doubt, Ecuador has made international headlines because of the denunciations, because we are in the epicenter of this pandemic in Guayas province, in Guayaquil in particular, which has been severely hit by this health crisis. The health authorities are insisting that measures are being taken in order to resolve the situation, but the details have been heart-wrenching, and there is a lack of state intervention in terms of collecting the dead bodies caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what relatives say that there's no assistance, that they call the government lines in order to get assistance, but they get no response. Even the new applications that the government developed, these are not receiving any assistance through these apps. There's also talk about the losses of bodies. One of the public hospitals in Guayaquil has been reporting that people are not able to place the bodies of their beloved in the morgues of this hospital. But there's also complaints about the gaskets being overpriced. Likewise, the municipality of Guayaquil, the mayor of Guayaquil is going to open 2 new cemeteries. We don't know when these new cemeteries are going to be open, something that is of concern in the health sector, especially after the announcement made by the Deputy Minister of Health, Ernesto Carrasco, who said in a news briefing that over 1,600 health professionals, almost 40% of healthcare professionals in the country, have been infected by COVID-19. Then, in an interview to a local media outlet, the Minister of Health, Juan Carlos Ceballos, rectified this figure, but he says it was 477 different figures, which is even more worrisome. Likewise, from the central government, they said that it is the health professionals, the ones who died. However, one of the figures published by the medical college is sending condolences to 45 families. According to them, 45 doctors have already died because of COVID-19. Thank you, Denise. This is the situation of a country whose government took, let's say, late measures to protect the economy and then the health of the population. That's why we bring it up in our critical move today. The same way we're putting up our strategic move for you to join our analysis. Pairs of our life in the economic keys. What should be the priority for our governments in times of pandemic? Give us your views and become one of our analysts in our strategic move. We're going to a break and we'll come back. I didn't have any means to live. I only have this. I don't have any pensions. I don't have any relatives. Nothing. So I live off this day to day. If we are on quarantine, I can go out. If I don't go out. I can eat. So I rely on my sales. Everything increased prices. Sugar, food, everything. Unfortunately, there's no place to get your food. You live day to day. They cut back 50% of the wages. How am I going to live? I have to pay rent. I have to go to the grocery, where the groceries are very expensive. It's very expensive. Those were the statements by the people in those countries where the neoliberal governments rule. So a while ago, we were listening to the views of international organizations in the context of COVID-19. Let's listen now to what are the thoughts of some of the leaders of our region and in some of those countries where the people would just listen to are from and draw your own conclusion. We have to get back to work. Our people want to work. They want to go back. They have to go back. I'm hearing it loud and clear from everybody. This is a country that was built on getting it done. So we'll see what happens. The virus has arrived. We are fighting it and soon it will pass. Our lives have to go on. Jobs must be kept. The family support must be preserved. We must get back to normal. I call on state and municipal authorities to abandon their scorched earth ideas, the banning of public transport, the closing of commerce, and mass confinement. I hereby order in this decree the special plan for the payment of salaries in small and medium industries and businesses through the Patria system for the next 6 months. I also establish in this decree the immediate nationwide elimination of payment of rents for business and main houses for 6 months. In the next 6 months, there will be no cutting of telecommunications services in the country. Telecommunication must be fully insured. Fully insured. That is how all public services are guaranteed in Venezuela. The suspension for the next 6 months of payment of capital and interest for all credits, as well as second, the suspension and moratorium of payment during this time. There you go. One position versus the other. Neoliberalism has led the countries which adopted that system to a social crisis of incalculable consequences in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's review the context in Latin America. Countries such as Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, and Chile report the highest number of cases affected by COVID-19 in Latin America as a result of policies implemented by the government in the face of a health emergency, prioritizing the economy over saving human lives. President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has been skeptical about the seriousness of the pandemic. The numbers are increasing. In just under a month, the country records more than 12,240 cases and over 500 deaths. In the midst of this panorama, the Brazilian president minimizes the disease while defending the reopening of commercial activity. Ecuador, the second country with more cases reported in the region, lives long days of tragedy with more than 300,700 cases and more than 190 deaths in just 14 days. The city of Guayaquil is the hardest hit. Guayas province tops the list with 130 deaths and more than 2,500 cases, which represents 67% of total cases in the country. Add to this the health crisis which the region is facing with overcrowded hospitals and collapsed intensive care units, and the situation with the dead bodies, whose number on the wait list to be removed from the houses reached 450. In Chile, the number of persons affected is also increasing. Since the first case was detected about 1 month ago, 37 deaths have been recorded and more than 4,800 cases have been registered. In this context, while in some countries such as Venezuela, Argentina, and Cuba, there are policies to access the test free of charge, in others, like the above mentioned, patients must face additional costs or resort to private labs to find out whether they are infected by COVID-19. The price of the test range between $80 and $200. Experts agree that neoliberalism, as the prevailing system in these countries, has entered into a world crisis, as it is unable to confront the real problems of the large majorities, as its priorities is only a small segment of society and the wealthy multinationals. Now we're going to the analysis in our critical move from Caracas, Venezuela. We're accompanied by Ingerson Freites, Masters in International Economy, and in Quito, Ecuador, Nicolas Reyes, also a political analyst. Welcome, both of you. Welcome to our critical move today. I will start with Ingerson. Greetings from our staff. On our political board, we have the economic impact that COVID-19 is having on, especially on the Latin American and Caribbean population. And on the basis of the context we have prepared for our viewers to familiarize themselves with this impact from the microeconomy, from the pockets of our people, even to when accessing a test to detect whether they have or not COVID-19, up to the macroeconomy, looking at the economy of the country and the economy of the region. What has failed here? Good afternoon, greetings to you. Thank you for the invitation. Well, by assessing everything that is taking place at the global scale and translating it into our region, Latin America, we can see and evaluate of the failure of neoliberalism as a model to be followed in the world. Uh, Recently, several analysts of world relevance, even Joseph Stiglitz, World Economy Nobel Prize in September, wrote an article with the aid of neoliberalism and the researchers of history. Neoliberalism was unable to give mankind the stability, the economic stability that it forecasted, and it introduced the greatest dilemmas of economies, like getting out of poverty, inequalities, and to have a world with a better ecological balance. This model failed, and coronavirus has revealed this failure. Thank you, Ingerson. Stay with us. Now we bring in Nicolas Reyes, political analyst. He's accompanying us from Quito, Ecuador, and from the geographic situation where you are located, Nicolas. How do we understand that before we were a victim of this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, governments in the region which opted for introducing neoliberalism, for taking into account the alleged advantages of this system, they said this is for the good of our people. The support that we are receiving from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund is to make our country a better place. However, we see that the figures of victims and deaths in those countries in Latin America are way higher than those countries who never abandoned progressive lane and social progress. Dear Ray, it's a pleasure to greet you. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings, cordial greetings to everyone watching us now. Great hug and my solidarity for anyone who have lost the beloved because of this situation, and to all those people who are suffering this situation right now. perhaps it's worth putting some context of the elements that we are seeing. Recently, there was a document, a very important document, which is a special report drafted by ECLAC, which I take advantage of this space to congratulate Alicia Barzana for her work, as well as her whole team. And they were looking at the economic and social impacts by COVID-19 in the region, and especially and around the world as well, but with an emphasis in Latin America. It is worth highlighting that we came from a scenario of an economic slowdown in the region since 2014, which heavily impacted the countries in the region. We have to remember that also in the same critical cycle of capitalism, already in 2008, there was a crisis of financial markets which affected heavily the countries of our region. And especially from 2014, the economy has been having a slowdown, having an impact on the increase in inequality and poverty, with an impact on the most vulnerable population. Without a doubt, we have to point out that Latin America, unfortunately, continues to be the most unequal continent. When we look at the social inequality, we realize that Latin America is the most disparate continent. It's not to say that it's the poorest continent, because we have the conditions to have the wealth, to redistribute our wealth. But unfortunately, there's been a system, an economic system, a political system that has not redistributed wealth correctly and has affected the largest majorities. What, just to put a better question, what has been the influence on what has prompted the greatest inequalities in Latin America? And I can cite a number of countries. Yeah, without a doubt, there has been a model. The main cause has been a neoliberal model that has prioritized the market instead of social policies. When the COVID-19 arrives in Latin America, there were a number of countries that prioritize the elements related to free markets, elements related to the weakness of state in areas which are very important, like health, like education, and social inclusion. In this regard, let's say the pandemic has hit some countries and region which had already been weakened because of this of the neoliberal models implemented in the age, which had led to precisely increase the logic, the market logic, to the detriment of strengthening the state and strategic sectors like health, education, and other areas, critical areas for social policy. So we come from that context. So when you ask why the pandemic has hit so heavily in Latin America, it's precisely because many of these elements were already weakened. For example, in Japan, uh, there are around 7 hospital beds per 1,000 inhabitants. In Latin America, it's 2.2 beds per 1,000 inhabitants. The same we can say about the number of doctors. So the private space, the sectors have been privatized to a large extent, and that has served for a pandemic of this magnitude hits heavily Latin America. This is one of the most heavily hit regions socially and economically because it came already from a logic of state weakening by and social sectors like health, education, and social inclusion. Thank you, Nicolas and Ingerson. All of those things that Nicolas just explains uh, brings down the vision that until recently we had in Latin America and beyond, but especially in Latin America, about the values of privatization, about the merits of private health, private education, and the agencies in charge of selling food, and to the importance of decentralization. Just to cite an example, Chile, which was the the poster boy for neoliberalism in the region, establishing as a synonym, this as a synonym of ultra mega development in the region. Everything in Chile is good, and everything that the Chileans have access to just because living in Chile, which is a fallacy, everything is top class. And then we see that the countries that more faithfully follow the neoliberal model are the countries that most have forgotten their peoples, which are the ones who are suffering the most. Yes, in the case of Chile, and it happens worldwide, neoliberalism has become a myth of welfare, and very few could access in reality to those benefits. The global media, which are very much linked to the big capitals, were the ones to supported that myth. So there's an undercurrent which has come to a breaking point in Latin America and around the world about the real relationship, social and economic relationship of neoliberalism. What happened in Chile? We were sold the myth of a country, of a successful country. We saw that since last year, inequality in Chile, privatization of the most basic things for life, were creating a discontent that led to a social explosion. And that happened in many countries like Colombia, Peru. A supposedly successful model, forgetting about the most important elements for life, not only education, but also health, the importance of health as a key element for life. And they were privatized under a neoliberal model in Latin America. And today, we were caught by this pandemic in the midst of a hospital crisis, with a health crisis, and it's not only that the state did not invest enough in health, but the health system are unable to absorb what could be a worsening of the pandemic in Latin America. Without a doubt, the model must be changed. Without a doubt, after the COVID-19, I'm sure there is a resurgence of economic laws. We have to rewrite the economic laws after the COVID-19 pandemic, and possibly we could go back to the welfare state from 1929 in order to be able to move forward. We have to learn the lessons, especially for the conditions imposed on Latin America as exporting countries, as countries exporting commodities without developing their own economic apparatus. And we have to overcome that. There should be greater integration from the countries of the South in order for us to establish our own model, the Latin American way. The Latin American way, like China, established its progressive model, but the Chinese way. And I take this advantage of this in order to highlight that it's Wednesday in China, and the quarantine was lifted in Wuhan, the epicenter of COVID-19. It was the source where everything started, at least according to the international media. But this is a very debatable issue, whether it was in China where COVID-19 originated. Thank you so much, Ingerson. Thank you, Nicolas. I invite you both to stay on our second moment for analysis. Thank you both. We're going to go to a break. Remember that you can become an analyst in our critical move through our Twitter account, The Pulse of Life. In geoeconomics terms, we wonder what should be the priority for our governments in terms of pandemics. Give us your views. We'll go to a break and we'll soon come back. Let's review the evolution of the situation in the economic situation in North America and Europe, where the highest number of world cases are recorded due to the quick spread of the COVID-19. Today, the United States is the epicenter of the pandemic, which, since January, when the first cases were reported to date, has recorded 368,100 cases and 10,900 deaths, according to figures offered by Johns Hopkins University. In the state of New York alone, more than 110,000 people suffer from the pandemic, and there have been over 47,000 deaths, almost half the number at the national level. This rapid increase in the number of cases is accompanied by the weak measures implemented by Donald Trump's government focused on saving the economy above saving human lives. The American society today is facing a collapse of its health system. More than 30 million citizens do not have health insurance, and another 40 million access only inadequate plans with such high co-payments and costs that insurance only covers basic care. Europe is also a sample of the health crisis facing neoliberal governments. The novel disease has already left in Europe more than 49,400 deaths on over 605,000 infected cases. This is the subcontinent most affected. In Italy, 16,523 deaths have been reported, while in Spain there are 13,796 deaths. According to WHO, these two nations accumulate more than three-fourths of the deaths throughout Europe. Experts assure that neoliberalism has contributed since the 80s, with the world seeing no less than 4 great pandemics: Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. In this context, the implementation of policies have been one of the top contributing factors to the expansion of such diseases. As I said, our analysis continues. In Quito, we still have Nicolas Reyes, who was talking to him a while ago. So we're going to bring into this conversation from Russia David Gomez Rodriguez, a political analyst and writer. Welcome, David. We'll continue with Nicolas. As you said, we are on the geopolitical board. We are discussing the geopolitics of the issue, and based on the vision of the forecast by ECLAC in Latin America and the Caribbean, once the COVID-19 pandemic is over. So they are talking about a slowdown in the economy. So the question is still on, which I put in the previous block. What failed in these governments that were bragging about having the perfect system to face emergency situations like this, the COVID-19, from the economic standpoint, and today they are unable to resolve the situation. But also, for those governments, there will be economic slowdown. Greetings, Gray, to you and all the team in Telesur and the viewers that are watching us in Latin America. Without a doubt, we are looking at a very delicate situation, which is part of a larger crisis. We are only talking about a health crisis. We are not talking about an economic, general, and multi-factor crisis, which capitalism is living through today. In Latin America, we are watching concrete indicators. We saw that economic decline in 2019. Economic growth was 0.1%, and after the crisis, according to some figures provided by ECLAC, that this economic slowdown reaches a minus 4%, which is going to have a major impact in terms of the increase of poverty throughout the region. There is talk about 35 million new poor people in the region after this crisis. So you were asking which are the contributing factors influencing this situation, making it even worse. Evidently, as others before me have said, we have to blame neoliberalism as a model that has evidently failed in the 21st century, and in the 20th century and in the 21st century, some governments under American tutelage have been insisting on. So we have to add this into the analysis, the influence of the U.S. in terms of the regional economic policies. In addition to this permanent intervention by the U.S. In countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, it has been manifested in a terrible way in terms of public policies to prevent precisely those social disasters like the ones we are seeing today. We are also seeing, in contrast to this, how progressive countries which undertook integration policies and policies to defend the social rights of the people are much more better prepared to face this crisis and have created prevention models and direct attention for this crisis affect it to a lesser extent the population. We see in the case of Cuba that for every 1,000 inhabitants there is 7.5 doctors, which contrasts with the ratio of Latin America, which is way lower than that. We could mention other figures like thanks to the neoliberal model in Latin America, on average, they invest 2.2% of GDP in health, when the recommendation is reinvesting 6%. This leaves a clear signal that we have to change the model, and we must go back to the policies that at some point in time in Latin America were implemented in the early 20th century, when some countries assume progressive policies. We could even, where the interventionist policies undertaken by the U.S. at that point, that was when extreme poverty increased in Latin America, as my previous speaker said, and also there will be an increase of extreme poverty since 2014, in this increase in 8% to date. There's a 10.7% of extreme poverty. They talk about after the crisis, this figure could increase to 13%. I'm talking about extreme poverty, and this compels the Latin American governments to reorganize, to redefine their objectives within the region. Integration will be critical for this, and the implementation of social policies. And on those objectives, I want to go deeper later with you, David. But let me ask Nicolas. A few minutes ago, you were highlighting the position of ECLAC within the organization, its director, Alicia Bárcena, and the quality of the report that ECLAC just published. I'm asking you, how do you see, in light of our times, this policy of rescuing that carries forward the International Monetary Fund vis-a-vis what it contains the ECLAC report? Thank you, Ray, for the question. And I think that ECLAC report is, in addition, very clear in terms of the figures. Both in the world and in our region, we need to prioritize human lives. We need to prioritize saving lives. And that implies entering into renegotiation process of the debts. And it implies to enter collective bargaining processes, to design a new negotiation architecture with these kinds of agencies like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, etc. The priority is not paying the debt. The priority must be to save human lives, to strengthen the public health systems, to strengthen the education systems in order to resolve situations like those children who lack internet access, which is an important percentage in the region. So we need COVID. What COVID must do is to lead us to replan our social cohesion intra-regional trade and to renegotiate the terms of our debt. And for that, what we need is to come to multilateral agreements, to reach agreements that would allow us to strengthen the logic of social policies. However, what the International Monetary Fund, what it proposes, is to further indebt the countries. They are not suggesting, they're not proposing to renegotiate the debt, but they are proposing to further indebt those countries under the guise of assistance to fight COVID-19. Yes, we know the logic of the IMF. That through that, they generate control mechanisms for those countries. Without a doubt, this has been the logic since the last century, and that is precisely part of what we have to discuss. Because this logic, what it's done is to generate greater inequality, and that indebtedness, what generates is over dependency, and that is what we have to discuss. And from my standpoint, and it is also contained in the ECLAC report, what we need is to undertake more collective articulation processes, because it's different to have one-to-one negotiations than if we do it as a bloc. In the face of this pandemic of COVID, it makes clear the need for real regional integration, the need for negotiation process, and to move forward a new development agenda, because that led us to have greater vulnerabilities. The worst scenario could be even more drastic. They talk about -4% growth. We're going through recession, a regional recession, and the region is going to be heavily hit. I mentioned two elements. One is the decline in oil prices that hit especially countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, etc. Second is the issue of tourism that is going to decline and it will hit the Caribbean. So we need to know that we're going to go through very tough situations, and that we're going to go through a debt renegotiation process, and that implies to implement social policies instead of paying the debt. In just a quick 2 minutes, Nick, I want to hear your conclusions on these issues. You were mentioning actions that are necessary. Without being a fatalist, a pessimist, now we are affected by COVID-19, and the world is not free in the future of suffering new pandemics. With a future vision and very clearly, very briefly, what needs to be done in the world and in Latin America. Now comes to my mind an idea from Chavez to create a common fund for Latin America and to turn our backs on the IMF regional fund that is more in solidarity with the countries that need it. We need to construct a common vision and to devise concrete policies in different ambits. We need to take a new turn of the wheel and to go back to regional integration, which is the only way whereby Latin America is going to achieve human development, and we be in a position to counter this crisis. We cannot go on with the model of dependency from any standpoint, whether economic or political. We have to rethink our projects like UNASUR, ALBA, or PetroCaribe, and to have to emphasize solidarity and understand this feeling, and to establish a permanent dialogue, leaving aside ideological differences. It's true that, for instance, today there is no sovereign policy in terms of pharmaceuticals. So we spend $5 billion in terms of health in Latin America. We have to revert that tendency, and we can only do that with social organization, with a common economic policy and with a political vision that allows us to face the powers, and finally that see us only as a place where they can get raw materials for their own development, neoliberal projects and imperialistic projects in many of the cases, particularly when we speak about the United States. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Nicolas, for your time in a critical move. This we're going to conclusions. The economy or human health, or economy for health. That continues to be the question of the neoliberal government's top representatives in terms of pandemic. Progressive leaders, for their part, have not hesitated at the time of making decisions. Life first, supported by social production supply programs, such as the CLAP in Venezuela, and then the gradual recovery of the economic apparatus. Then the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us a lesson. It is that the world lacks a real fund, a reserve, away from the interest of the World Bank and the IMF to prevent hard economic impacts in such situations, which demand necessary periods of social protection to save the essential, life. For today, we're closing our geopolitical board.